Hello, everyone. Hi. Oh, that's really loud. You made it to this session. Congratulations. My name is Aidan, and I use he, him pronouns. And I have been involved with YouthCO for the past year and a bit. And it's been a really powerful experience for me. And I thought that bringing this panel together was really important. It could be a really great conversation to have here at the summit. So before we start, we'll just start with introductions, but people are just going to introduce themselves, and overall there's just going to be a very flexible format here, so if at any point you want to stop and ask questions or ask for clarity, we are super open and flexible to that. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Shain. I use he, him, his pronouns. I work with YouthCO through the Empowerment program. I live in Prince George, so I run the Empowerment program in there. And yeah, this is my third year at the summit, and I'm always happy to be here. And around this time, I'm always happy to leave. So.
Hi everyone, my name is Aidan. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the manager of the Empowerment program at YouthCO. And fun fact, the first time I was at the conference was about 4 or 5 years ago when I was a participant at Empowerment.
Hi there, my name is Chown. I'm currently the executive director at YouthCO and get the pleasure of working with these three lovely folks as well as many others. I use the pronouns she and her, and the last time I was on this stage, I was wearing a shark hat, so if you're bored during our presentation, you can find that at the CBRC Summit hashtag.
I'll do that. So this is a brief outline, but I also thought it would be good to give a little bit more context as to why we wanted to create this panel. So I moved to Vancouver about a year and 2 months ago in September to start school at UBC. I was also fortunate to be supported by a research grant to do implementation science, if someone could explain that to me, at YouthCO and help with the scale up of a program called Empowerment that was happening in Prince George. And I remember one of the first conversations we had when we were talking about, okay, what does program scale up look like if we have this program and we want to do it in Prince George? One of the first conversations was, how do we do it in the least colonial way? And I hadn't thought of it that way before, but that was literally what I was bringing to the work. I was coming from Toronto, thinking about doing this program in Prince George, a city I'd never been to before, and that made me start a process of reflecting more on the way that we do our work in the sector and the way that we use values to inform that type of work. Values at YouthCO are pretty central to our work from the point of from a primary point of contact. When you want to get involved with YouthCO, you go through a training called core training, and there's a significant amount of time working on understanding YouthCO's values and going through them and interpreting them and understanding what they look like for each of us. So the values are listed here. We have anti-oppressive, youth-led, chachsai, which is a Squamish word meaning generosity, sex-positive, inclusive, and innovative. And so these terms are examined within the context of even just wanting to get associated with YouthCO to understand what is kind of guiding our work when we're moving forward. We also have 4 different approaches. So we have community engagement, shared leadership, harm reduction, and peer education and support. So we have values that may inform some of the content of what we're doing or may inform how we do things, but ultimately these 4 approaches are the how of what we do at YouthCO. So because we are from YouthCO, we have an activity. And Sarah, I don't know if you want to. Did you want me to talk about the last thing first? Oh, yep, never mind. So before we start this activity, Sarah is going to share some reflections on values from YouthCO's perspective.
Thanks, Aidan. So as Aidan did a great job introducing our values and approaches, we always are in a sort of a challenging place in how we talk about our values publicly and how we navigate the walking the talk and trying to think through that. And so I think when we interview so many great youth for our positions, one of the questions that they ask us at the end of the interview is often, what's the best part of working at YouthCO and what's the hardest part of working at YouthCO? And my answer is almost always our values and approaches. They're the best part of working at YouthCO because it helps us do better work, and it makes sure our work is grounded in so many really important ways of centering youth most impacted by HIV and Hep C. And they're the hardest part of their work because there's no way to be like, great, finished anti-oppression for the day, the week, the strat plan, it's done. And that's not really how these values work. And we all come to the work at YouthCO with different existing understandings of those values and different lived experiences of what that's felt like for us. And so that makes, the four of us on the panel probably have a slightly different opinion about what each one of our values looks like in action in each one of the hundreds of decisions we make a day about our programs, about our resources, about our time, about how we share space and are in community in a workplace. And so this, I think there's many examples of this, and the one that I wanted to talk about here today sort of follows well on the last presentation we just heard from Harlan, and it's about YouthCO's relationship to reconciliation work and working on land that we know is unceded and has been stolen from First Nations people here. So specifically, one of our values is Shashai, and this is a Squamish word, as Aidan said. And it really came from a Squamish Indigenous youth on our team who really wanted us to have a Squamish word as part of the work that we do. And it was a very, very important thing for her, and we were really excited to do that. And as it came closer and closer to the time to formally make this part of our value system, we realized that we didn't know enough about the teaching, and we weren't at all certain about how to pronounce the word. And so we were put in this position as an organization of people who are now not we don't have anyone on our team currently from the Squamish Nation, of wanting to honor that work and the labor that that person had done, but also feeling sort of icky about taking something that we didn't have the full context for. And so every time we present that value in our core training program, and when we talk about it publicly, there's both a lot of joy in that and also a lot of, we're still trying to figure it out. And so Brené Brown is someone who has done a lot of writing around shame and how that shows up in our workplaces. And one thing she talks about is the disengagement divide, which is this idea that when we have these great values that we talk about, people get really excited about it. And then when people show up in our programs or in our work and they see that we don't get these values right 100% of the time, it makes it really challenging. And so some of the things that we want to explore in this panel is where we're still trying to do better, and where we're doing things that we really think that other folks can learn from as well. I hope that made sense. I'm a little nervous, and I'm happy to talk about Brené Brown or our work around our values at any time. And now, because it's YouthCO, we're going to do an activity. So the way this activity works, we typically do it standing up, but it's 5 o'clock on a Thursday, and so we might not be feeling that. So what I'm going to invite folks to do is use your hands. So we're going to put a statement up on the slide, and you can use your hands to say if you agree really strongly, we'll be on this side of the room. If you disagree really strongly, you can put your hands on this side of the room. And wherever you are in between that spectrum, you can sort of move your hands accordingly. Questions or clarifications about the statement? Or the instructions, sorry? Okay, and then the second thing that I'll say is that we have designed statements to which there is no right answer. So this is not an activity in which we're going to choose which people to shame later, or there's a right answer and we're just seeing who's passing our test. We really want to invite folks into doing some reflection work with us about the different ways that we navigate these spaces and decisions that we make. Okay, so our first statement is our role as allies is to step back and amplify the voices of those experiencing oppression. If you were in an earlier session, you might have experienced this too. Oh, so if we strongly agree, I think I said this side. And if we strongly disagree, I think I said this side. All right, so you take a look around the room, and we don't have a roaming mic here, so it might be a little hard to have a conversation, but I think it's important to think about these types of statements as we go through our session. Okay, our next statement is one that we spend a lot of time thinking about at YouthCO. Again, strongly agree, strongly disagree. Organizations should ensure funders and donors are supportive before an organization takes a public stance on an issue. Awesome. Great. Well, I would love to have a glass of wine with you and talk more about this, so find me at 6 o'clock. Yeah. Shall I pass it over at this point? To?
And now Yvonne's going to come up.
I'll just sit here since my part is going to be short. Thank you so much, Sarah. Hopefully that activity gets you thinking about a little bit of the nuances of values, because that's a lot what we're going to be talking about today. The other half of what we're going to be talking about today is empowerment, and that's the context of all the information that we'll be sharing. Can I get a show of hands of people who have heard about the empowerment program before? Okay, so not everyone, but a lot of folks. For those who are less familiar with it, Empowerment is a queer-centered, trans-inclusive, gender-affirming program that is HIV leadership. Are you, sorry? Oh, okay. An HIV leadership program for young people to talk about sex, drugs, relationships, and all the things that bring us pleasure. We do this in lots of different ways, from discussion groups to workshops to social events. The program was originally adapted from a US program by the same name, and the important thing to note is that we've creatively adapted the program to fit our context and have changed a couple different things. Some of those things we'll be talking about today, but one really important part that we're not talking about today that's important to note is the program was initially developed to be an intervention prevention program, primarily for folks who are not living with HIV. But the way we do things at Empowerment in BC is as a program that's for all young people, including those of us who are living with HIV. So that's a core difference. And as I mentioned, the program started in 2012, originally in the Vancouver region, but has expanded to other regions, including the Fraser Health Authority, which for those who are familiar with the Lower Mainland is like everywhere from Burnaby all the way to Agassiz and Hope and everything in between, and also to Prince George in the north. And with that, I'll actually hand it over to Shain to talk a little bit more about Prince George.
Thanks, Van. So I'm going to start off with a little game of my own. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but there's this little thing where it was going around quite a while ago, and it was, you know you're from a small city when, or similar things to that. So I've compiled a few that I thought were kind of pointed or funny. So what I'm going to invite you to do is if these are true for you, just to raise your hand. So you know you're from a small city when you can name every person in your graduating class. More than I expected. Okay, cool. You know you're from a small city when people ask where you're from and you tell them the closest big city. You know you're from a small city when getting a Tim Hortons is the biggest deal of the decade. Yeah, fewer and fewer, but like, I get that one. You know you're from a small city when you're unfazed by seeing a tractor driving down Main Street. Yeah. Cool, thanks. So I have a few things, not quite as much as I need, but we'll go with it. What I'm going to mainly focus on are a couple of things that we've adapted for Prince George, and then as well a couple of things that are true about the Prince George empowerment as a whole. So the first one is transportation. I'm sure anyone that put up their hand knows that transportation in most of the province is terrible. So what this might look like is for a person that doesn't have a vehicle, getting around anywhere takes quite a long time. Even going to the grocery store or going to the movie theater, or like, I don't know, who still gets DVDs? Is that a thing? Doing anything when you don't have a vehicle is really difficult, and it takes up a lot of your day. So what we try to do with empowerment and how we work for anti-oppression is really to limit that barrier by driving people around. So in our empowerment events, we offer rides, and that just limits that as much as possible. Another reason that we do that is to limit the fear and danger that can be in public transit. Even walking, for those that might not present as cis or indigenous people or effeminate males, can present a real danger in smaller cities. Maybe a little caveat is that a lot of the difficulties and issues that people face are amplified in smaller cities. And again, those that put up their hand, I think, can maybe attest to that a little bit. And so the dangers of walking down the street at 6 p.m. on a February when it's already dark out can be dangerous. As well, a lot of things that are less dangerous but still really, really exhausting, like people staring or just unwanted attention, is really difficult for a lot of people. And like I said, we just minimize that completely by offering rides. And as well, on the flip side of that, for those that give the rides, we give honoraria. And that leads into my second point. Honoraria in general for empowerment is a huge value. It allows leadership, and it allows people in marginalized groups to really take hold of their opportunities, and any opportunities that we can give them is for the best. What I try to do in my empowerment group is rotate as many volunteers as I can. We have probably a core group of 7 or 8 people throughout or within the empowerment. But then within that we have maybe 5 or 6 that kind of filter in, filter out. I try to give everyone an opportunity for honoraria and volunteering, because actually Aidan and I just had a conversation about this a couple of days ago. A lot of times you can't know who's oppressed or who is marginalized just by looking at them. And I think that's something that we all know, but to implement it into empowerment in a way that allows everyone the same opportunity is really important. Just in case you know that one person is down on their luck and they need the extra money, etc. So many reasons. The differences in YVR versus Prince George empowerment look a little different. The uptake of new members is quite a slow process. I think that what I tell people is that I've started with my own network of friends, and then that slowly grew to what the empowerment membership is today. But that expansion was quite slow. We did a community assessment that showed what people feel they need to feel comfortable going to an event. And what we found is that they need to know what the event is about, and also they need to know who is going to the events. So in order to try to upkeep that process of expanding, we post photos to our Facebook, and then we also show who's going. But in a context of small rural cities, that's not always possible. I've been given the story of a town, maybe, I want to say it's like 5 hours away, Fort St. John. It's a smaller town than Prince George, but even in the same context, a lot of the things that are applicable to the empowerment Prince George couldn't apply to Fort St. John. Like I had mentioned previously, the issues that small towns face are amplified a lot of the times. And so something like posting photos of who's in the group or showing who's going to the event poses a real risk for a lot of people. So while the development and upscaling of empowerment in Prince George is a fantastic thing, in order to continue to do so in other cities, it's going to look incredibly different in every city. So that's always just something to keep in mind. And my last little bit here is about the Indigenous community as a whole. Empowerment Prince George, like I mentioned, is really a small group, and the expansion is it's getting there, but we're still working on it. One group of people that we've had a really hard time engaging with is the Indigenous community as a whole. I mean, there's something to say about a predominantly white group of people starting up this thing and then just hoping for other marginalized groups to come in. So I'm not saying that it's something that we shouldn't have seen, but it is an issue, and the way that we are going about fixing it and including all groups, including the Indigenous community, is by talking to people within the community and just outreaching to them rather than allowing them to come to us. So we have some hopes, but all in all, that's where we are. And that's all I have to say.
Cool, thanks, Shain. So I'm just gonna give a quick personal reflection on my experience at YouthCO. From the day that I first started working there, I noticed that I was a queer person of color, surrounded by a staff that was predominantly other people of color. And I thought that was such a unique experience, at least in my own lived experience. It wasn't something that I'd seen before. And I wanted to reflect a bit on what my relationship to that was and how I think that it is influencing the work. I didn't want it to just be, being a person of color, working with a predominantly people of color is very affirming and validating and great. I think that's something that a lot of people would agree with, but there's other pieces that I think would be good to think about as we're moving forward collectively within the sector. So one piece that I think about is hiring practices. I think that the ways in which we're thinking about equity and the ways that we're thinking about job postings need to be thoughtful in terms of being accommodating and understanding of people's different experiences and living within a specific society that aren't tokenistic as well. So I think about what does our emphasis on specific types of education or credentialing and specific experiences within specific roles. What does that mean for people of color, for other intersecting identities? Who has access to that education? Who has access to some of those positions? And who can even volunteer their time in order to get a bit of experience to even start in that work? So I think there's room for us to be reflective in terms of, how are we making room for different lived experiences and finding different ways of thinking that someone might be or not be qualified for a position. And then another piece is something that I'm still working through, is more related to the diagram on the slide. It's from a resource called Dismantling Racism that was shared by Aidan and was used, I think was shared through Camp Out, which is a great program in BC that you should definitely look up. But something that has been kind of ongoing within YouthCO's realm is a discussion around addressing white supremacy within the organization, within the sector. And I think that's a different dialogue than what's happening in a lot of organizations. Kind of reviewing this resource, there's a lot of discussion around the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And so the idea that there's a culture that's ever present in organizations, it's not necessarily something that you can name, but it was never something that was chosen by that group. And it doesn't necessarily make space for the different realities and cultures that people are bringing to the work, but it's just something that is. And I thought there's a huge list with a lot of reflections, these are just some of the pieces around that, but some of the ones that really resonated with me were around perfectionism. So the focus on how we need to do everything in the best way possible, the absolute right way, and that any mistakes need to be named, identified, and that person might actually internalize that and think of themselves as being inadequate. And really shifting that maybe to thinking about how can we, acknowledge and affirm that people did work and did it, and maybe there were some things wrong, but knowing that mistakes happen in any situation and making sure that there is an opportunity for growth and learning from that experience and not necessarily one that's based on deficiency. There's one around paternalism. So thinking that those with the most power are capable of making decisions for and in the interest of those without power. And decision-making processes are very unclear to those who don't have power and are very clear to those who do have that power. So thinking about, okay, what is our decision-making process? What is the clarity around that for all people that are affected by decisions? And how have we included the people who would be affected by those decisions into the decision-making process? Another one around objectivity, the belief that you can just be objective and that emotional responses or emotions in general are destructive and irrational and are not part of the process, when in reality, we are all subjective and we all have emotions, and maybe we can challenge the way that we view emotions within different contexts and organizations and recognize, people's lived experiences and how everyone is bringing that experience to the work, and maybe challenge the idea that there is always objectivity. And one that that really resonated with me was a sense of urgency. So we really want quick and visible results. That's our priority. And there's not a lot of time built into it to think about how can we do this work in a way that it, might align with our values, that is inclusive of different stakeholders, and requires some more thoughtful decision making. I think about it, there's been a lot of instances where there's like a grant call that comes up, and then in the 48th hour, you decide that you want to apply for it, and then you come up with an idea of what you're going to do, and it's like, okay, if we fund this, given the time that we've actually put into thinking about this, will we be able to do it in a good way, or are we already setting ourselves up for failure? So, thinking about having realistic work plans and building in accommodation for longer processes, that things might take longer than you anticipate, and being okay with that. And just building that into the culture within the organization, I think, could provide some radical shifts in the way that we approach our work. And so those are some of the reflections that I have from this resource, and I'd encourage everyone to check it out and reflect on it and think about the ways that that might apply to their own situations. Cool.
Thanks, Aidan. I'm going to stand because I'm a facilitator and I like to move around. I hope that's okay. If you've forgotten, my name is Aidan, and I'm the manager of the Empowerment program at YouthCO, and I have the highly coveted position of not only being on the last panel of the day, but being the last presentation of that panel. So thank you in advance for your time, and if the only thing you do for the next 10 minutes is keep your eyes open, I will consider that a huge win. So I'm going to be talking about gender and language and how those two things come together at Empowerment in a way that helps us live our values. But first, I just wanted to start by naming a really important truth about values for me, and that's that values are complicated. We saw that a little bit in the conversation that Sarah led and the activity. But what I mean by that is values are an imperfect tool to make decisions in a world that we're often required to make perfect decisions, and what I believe in a field where making perfect decisions can be very useful. We're in the field of health, where we're dealing with people's lives, the lives of people that we care about, the communities that we care about, and for many of us, we're part of those communities. So I know that having the perfect right answer to any decision moving forward is a really high stakes question, and I just want to start by saying that I don't have a perfect answer to how to do gender and how to do language in a good way in our programs. I just have some thoughts and reflections about what has worked at Mpowerment and what hasn't worked. So it's not a recommendation, but just some reflections for you to pick up and hopefully get a concrete takeaway. Is that okay? Yeah? Awesome. So I have your consent to talk at you for the next 10 minutes about this. Great. So language, gender, empowerment. For those of you who are familiar with empowerment and have been following it a little bit more closely, you might know that we've changed our language almost 100 times since the program has started. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's definitely true to say we've changed the language that we use to describe our program about as many times as we've had new staff and new really involved board members or volunteers in the program. So it's probably over a dozen times, which to many folks might seem like an absurd amount in 6 years, but that's just the way we roll at YouthCO. And what I mean by that is it's the way we live innovation and youth leadership. We recognize that as people who are new come into the program, new knowledge might come into the program, new ideas, and new ways of illuminating barriers and solutions to those barriers that might have existed. So we go for it. And we've gone for it a couple times over the years, but 2 times in particular, or around 2 language changes in particular, I want to focus on. The first actually predates me and involves lots of people who are actually at this conference in making that language change possible. A lot of board members and trans guys in particular really advocated to explicitly name trans men in our program. And the history of this has more to do with the adaptation of empowerment from the US to BC. So in loose terms, the US version really named gay guys in a way that trans folks were understood to be implicit in that. Guys being trans men and cis men, but not in an explicit way. So over the first few months to few years at Empowerment, we shifted that to name trans guys in a specific and explicit way. The latest version of that was something along the lines of young, gay, bi, queer guys who are trans and cis. So in that way, the trans guys know that it's an explicit naming and it's not an assumption of whether they're welcomed or not. But that's not the language change that I'm going to be talking about today. It's actually a more recent language change over the last 6 months. And you may have noticed that language when I introduced the program. And that language is Empowerment is a queer-centered, trans-inclusive, gender-affirming program for young people. Now that's a little bit different from the previous iteration in a couple ways, but 2 main ways. One, it doesn't necessarily name a specific group of people. It talks about the space and the content of the program. But the second piece is that it doesn't categorically name men or masculinity or masc folks in general. And that might seem really confusing or strange for a program that started off being around queer guys and in a sector where the work around queer guys is really important. But I'm going to ask you to stick with me just for a second and think about the ways that we live our values at YouthCO, and specifically around anti-oppression. So for me, anti-oppression means lots of different things, but one of the things that it means is finding ways to reduce or eliminate the barriers to full participation in our programs that are the result of systemic oppression in the world. So like sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all those pieces is how it comes together for me. And we've done that in a couple ways with that language change, not necessarily eliminating any of those structures, but definitely finding ways to better include folks in our program and make it more accessible. There's a long list of reasons why we did that, but I want to focus on 2 main changes and 2 main reasons why we made that change. The first is around trans guys, or some trans guys, and the other reason is around trans femme folks. And again, I know the trans femme part might be a little bit confusing at this point around a program that's for queer guys, but we'll talk about that in a second. So trans men, are you with me? Awesome, cool. So we said that the initial language of the program explicitly named trans guys after the first range. So queer, bi, gay guys who are trans or cis. So explicitly naming it. But anybody who's part of any group know that within that group there's some degree of heterogeneity. And that's true for trans men too. And one of the really complex and I'd say fucked up ways that trans men are made to be different in a cis-centric world is by cis folks placing values on them in a way that they are read and respected in their gender differently among themselves. So another way of saying that is some trans guys, people perceive and understand them and respect and read them as their gender identity, and some other trans guys, that's not true for them. Does that make sense? Some nods. Another simpler way of saying that is, you may have heard passing, so some trans guys pass, some trans guys don't pass. I didn't really use that, so you can like fold that up and put it in your pocket, and we'll talk about passing at another time, but really respecting and being read in their gender identity. Does that make sense? Awesome. So how is that relevant to the empowerment program? I'll give you a scenario. Imagine this is a discussion group. We're talking about cruising, and it's already started, and two trans guys walk through the door. The first, based on how they express themselves and how that interfaces with our preconceived notions around what men are supposed to look like and supposed to be like, we read and respect that trans guy in his gender identity. So what happens? He comes in, and the host or people in the room are like, come on in, have a seat, right? The second person, also a trans guy, but based on the way that they express their gender and how that interfaces with the way we understand how men are supposed to be like, we don't necessarily read and respect that person in their gender identity. What do you think happens? For those of us in the room who are trans, that needs some explanation. But for those of us in the room who are cis, the answer might come a little bit less readily, but we can probably make some fairly accurate guesses. Stares is something that usually happens. So we might all turn around and stare at that person, make them feel a little bit uncomfortable, kind of wonder why they're here or not. And then the second piece that I've often seen happen in programs, including empowerment over the years, and lots of other programs that are gender specific, is the follow-up question, trying to figure out if that person is in the right space. There might be assumptions like, are they in the right room? Did they get the date wrong, the time wrong, the building wrong? And sometimes that question might be benign or even helpful from the host or a well-intentioned participant. For myself, in the YVR program, every new participant, I ask the same question when they come in the door. Are you looking for empowerment? And I ask that to everyone. And that question is meant to be helpful, but for a person who knows better than anyone else that the way that they understand their gender is not going to be read and respected by folks in the room, that question interfaces with a real anxiety, an anxiety that that difference exists and what that difference means. That question can make them feel like they don't belong here. Does that make sense? Yeah. So imagine a different role, a different room, where the language isn't gender specific and the room isn't gender specific. The language is queer-centered, trans-inclusive, gender-informing. Doesn't really talk to who's supposed to be in the room or not. The second person comes through their door, and certainly their anxieties and the realities around the way we might perceive their gender is still going to be there. Their expression and the way they understand that might be very different from our preconceived notions. That's still going to be true. The language change doesn't end cis-sexism and bias and discrimination, but what it changes is what that means. Us having a different understanding of who they are from who they know themselves to be doesn't mean that they don't belong here. There's no one who's supposed to be here. At no point in time do you have to show your guy card to be in the room. Anyone is welcomed. We're going to be talking about queer stuff, trans stuff, gender stuff, but regardless of your gender, you're welcome in the room. So that anxiety is in some way reduced. And that's part of the reason why we changed that language. There might be some questions about that, and we can talk about that after, but I want to really focus on a second example that might illuminate it a little bit more, and that's around trans femme folks. And I want to just right off the bat say that gay cis guys and trans women, different groups of people, different lived experiences, different barriers, and different solutions to those barriers. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about more around gender fluidity. Can I get a show of hands if you've heard those two words put together before? Awesome, cool. The way I understand it to be, in a really nutshell, is the way we understand, experience, and express our gender can change over time and context. And that can not be linear in the sense that it can go back and forth and in lots of different directions. But what does that mean for our participants at Empowerment? It means that someone who understands themselves to be a guy, it doesn't matter whether it's queer guy or gay guy, just a guy, at the beginning of their engagement with our program, might at some point not identify as a guy anymore. In fact, we've had many participants who found language for themselves at Empowerment or found language for themselves at other programs in YouthCO that invited them to understand and know themselves as trans feminine. And what that means is that when that person realizes this, they're presented with a choice when we have a gender-specific space. That choice is to continue engaging in our program in a way that might be dishonoring to their gender or untruthful, or to leave the program. And when you overlay that on the reality that in Vancouver, at least in Vancouver, there aren't many programs for trans femme people, trans femme youth that do things in anti-oppressive, inclusive ways around HIV, the choice for that participant isn't actually to leave Empowerment and to go somewhere else. It's to leave Empowerment and leave all access to programming around HIV. And that's something that we really wanted to try to avoid by making that language change. So there are two small examples that I hope get some thinking on that. And I'm recognizing the time, so I just want to close with, it's not all rosy, and with every change comes challenges. And I think the biggest challenge for us that we're experiencing right now is really an increased naming of problems within the program or limitations within the program to actually meet the needs of trans folks. And I don't really see that as a problem so much as an opportunity, because what's interesting about it is that the heterogeneity of our program participants hasn't changed since the language has shifted. And what that means is that the people who have always accessed our program are still the people who are accessing our program. It's only been 6 months. But what has changed is the visibility of that heterogeneity. And I find that really interesting, that with that change in language, people feel more comfortable and safer in naming the way that our program is failing them. And if the biggest problem that we're experiencing since the change is that we now know our problems, I will take that. Thank you.
So when we started this, I said that the best and hardest part of work at YouthCO is our values, and what you've seen today is an example of the best part of our values, in that we heard from 3 amazing folks grappling with really big questions that I'm really proud and honored to work with every day. So let's give another round of applause for all 3 of them. The last thing I want to say on that is that this is also an example of the hardest part of our values. We heard about 3 people who have done a tremendous amount of labor and will continue to do a tremendous amount of labor, the 3 folks that are up here, as well as the folks who came before them and loved our program, and the folks who came before or at the same time who really struggled in our program and who we caused harm to in our programs. And those are the folks that are still in our some of those folks are still in our program today, and some of those folks are no longer participating in our program. But without those concerns that folks have continued to raise to us and helping us be better, we wouldn't be here. So I wanted to recognize all of that work and invite you into continuing to grapple with these questions, to chat with us about our programs, to think about this in your own programming context. And Aidan, I think, is going to share this closing reflection. No, I'm going to share this. Excellent. So one of the pieces that we share with everyone who joins the YouthCO staff team as part of our onboarding is a piece called "This Reconciliation is for the Colonizer." And it's a really challenging piece for those of us who are settlers to think about what reconciliation whether or not reconciliation is doing more for us as settlers or for Indigenous folks. And I have really appreciated some of the reflections that have been shared by Harlan today on reconciliation. And I think holding this piece alongside that idea of reconciliation is a really important thing for us to continue to explore together. Thanks so much. If there's questions, I think we have a few minutes for questions, but I also think folks might be anxious for wine. So we'll take a few questions, but we won't be upset if you leave early. Yeah, I think the mics are on. If you wouldn't mind, that would be great.
I just wanted to get some clarification on the, there was a queer person of color diagram, and I think in the center it said white supremacy culture, and so I wasn't really sure as to what that was meaning, because like my first reaction to that was that if you're essentially born white, then you're of the kind of people that likes to torture and burn and be violent to other humans. Just that white supremacy has a different connotation. I wasn't sure what that was meaning, so kind of reacting to that.
Yeah, so for me, and sorry, apologies if I didn't set that up in the right way, this resource was specifically talking about within different organizations and how some like working cultures might be rooted in white supremacy values. And so that this culture that's not necessarily something that we chose or set up ourselves, but might just be in existence and everyone is just kind of operates within it and it's happening and we don't know who set it up, but we're like totally doing it and complicating just the way that we see it and the way that it shows up in our work and thinking about how this was kind of decided maybe before we even joined an organization, but for people of color who often or usually were never part of creating these institutions, we're never part of the creating what that culture looked like.
Okay, but it is not implying that if you're white that you're an automatic Nazi.
No.
Okay.
No.
Thanks.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question. That's really important. And I think the key piece for me is like the supremacy piece is really important to think about. I think Aidan illuminated a little bit of this, but the way I think about it is if you think about whiteness as a culture and you think about other groups of people who might have a different culture, different ways of doing things, if we take even one of those, for example, sense of urgency, being quick or urgent or like efficient about something isn't inherently bad. What's bad, I think, or really troubling or what we might want to change is that being the only way and seen as the best way of doing things. I know Harlan, actually, who spoke earlier, taught me a really important lesson around the sense of urgency and the way that that's different in Indigenous cultures. And it's something that I still practice today, is in doing a closing round one time, I was really like rushing for us to finish. So I gave everyone 2 minutes to process 4 days of camp in their reflection, which was just not enough. And at the end of it, he was like, you know, that's not the way that we do things in our culture. And he said, you should really ask yourself next time, what's the worst that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? So I recognized that like doing it efficient to have everyone have 2 minutes is definitely one way of doing something. But what I had what I had not done was given people the ability to fully process that weekend. So both are good ways of going about things. It's, I think, when we value one over the other, it's the supremacy piece. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for your presentations, Marc-André from Gatineau. I'm wondering, as you've sort of reconfigured the program, it sounds a few times over the years, what have you been hearing from participants, either through informal discussion or formal evaluation about the reasons why they decided to come into the program, so what their expectations and anticipations were, and coming out of it, what they found was of most value for them. I'm wondering if there's any changes there, and particularly if there are changes in those results as you've reconfigured the program over the years.
Sarah?
Excellent, thanks, Aidan. So I've been involved at YouthCO for 2-3 years, something like that, and I got to spend one month or so as the empowerment coordinator, and that's sort of the closest I've been to the program. And like many nonprofits, we struggle to figure out the best way of doing program evaluation and in a way that resonates with our participants, works with our values, and is funded while being funded at the level that we do. So I don't have a documented answer for you, Marc-Andre, unfortunately. What I can tell you is that empowerment has had such an impact on so many folks that have come through the program, and that has been true, I think, through the time that the program has existed. Some of the things that I think have changed is the amount of space the program has to talk about gender, and when it's organized around a men's frame, whether that's cis and trans men or guys, that space is quite a bit different. And so I think that I would guess, and folks on the panel can shift if or add if this doesn't resonate, but folks are able to think about gender more in the current configuration of the program than would have happened before. And part of that is our change in language. Part of that is who our facilitators are. So as a peer program, our facilitators are able to speak to their experiences, and as we have facilitators on our team who think more about gender or who have spent more time deconstructing gender or thinking about how gender fits into their life, that opens up more space for our participants as well.
Can maybe share one small anecdote?
Please do.
Yeah, since the language change in particular, and if this is the only win that we got from that change, I'm so happy for it. We really reflected on what we're sharing on social media, and one of the things that we shared recently was a post around PrEP use and the way that that interfaces with hormone therapy for trans femme folks, or trans femme folks who are taking estrogen. And someone in the program, a couple events after, so 2 or 3, was just like, that post really helped me out. And that's not something that we would have necessarily focused or thought about posting before changing it to be more non-cis male-centric, or even like male-centric around the estrogen use. So.
Thanks. And if you want to learn more about some of the conversations we've been having about gender, we have some pretty transparent stories that we've shared in our blog. So I can't remember what it is, but if you go to our blog page, so youthco.org/blog, it'll be like the 3rd or 4th sort of open reflection on how cis sexism was showing up across our programs and some things that we were doing to change it. So that's how we sort of announced this language change that Aidan shared today. Any other questions? Great. Well, all 4 of us really appreciate that you spent the time with us right before the end of the day. And we're really looking forward to chatting more about the program more informally. So please come find us, and thank you so much.